Thank you, Lee, and thank you all very much for your generosity and your kindness. Maggie and I have thoroughly enjoyed being here and relishing the Nova Scotia hospitality and getting to know some of you. It's been a great joy, and we look forward to seeing some of you when you come to the north of England. I know that you not perhaps all will make it that far north. When you visit, you'll probably just do the usual thing of London and Stratford and Oxford and Cambridge, and then you'll think that's done. But actually, no, come further north, and Durham is waiting for you. My theme tonight is the confrontation between the power of God and the powers of the world. And I want to bring that confrontation into sharp and dramatic focus by highlighting in particular the matchless scene towards the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus and Pontius Pilate confront one another, representing precisely the power of God and the power of the world. And this is the scene, incidentally, but not unimportantly, in which ancient historians have regularly recognized historical verisimilitude. People often say, well, we're not quite sure about how much of the rest of John really is as historical as it might be, but this looks like what a Roman provincial trial of a suspect might well have been like. I was put in mind of this scene by a letter I received early last year. My correspondent noted that I had joined in the public criticism of our British Prime Minister Tony Blair for his support of the American action in Iraq. And my correspondent declared that while he actually agreed with me on the substantive issue, he thought I should not have impugned Mr. Blair's integrity in terms of his speech that he made in the House of Commons and so on. And my correspondent then went on to ask, and this is the point, granted that when Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth, Jesus didn't reply, does that mean that John, or even Jesus, is tacitly acknowledging that truth is merely subjective, so that one person's opinion on the deepest questions is always as good as another's? When Jesus gave no reply, did that mean there isn't an answer to what is truth? Now, to raise the questions of truth and power, which is what John's narrative does at this point, is to arrive at the center of some of the most pressing questions of our contemporary culture. The good news, though this may come as a surprise to some, is that the Bible is deeply interested in these questions, far more interested than many of its interpreters have been in the last couple of centuries. And it is with a sense of anticipation, therefore, that we launch into our theme of the new imperialism which has appeared within the postmodern world, and inquire whether there is anything particularly Christian or biblical to say about it. Certainly John would say that there is. In Johannine terms, Pontius Pilate represents the world which on the one hand was made through the Word of God, but the world which did not know that Word. Quoting, of course, from the prologue. The world into which the disciples were being sent, John 17, John 20. The world which was not, after all, the source of Jesus' kingdom, but which was indeed its goal. In other words, Jesus says, my kingdom is not from this world, but John has Jesus say, God so loved the world. The world is kind of ambiguous, therefore, in John. Well, not exactly ambiguous, just many-sided. And this love of God for the world and the sending of the Son to redeem the world is the point, of course, that the Gnostic can never understand, which is why Gnosticism cannot generate or sustain a biblical political theology, which is why it was, despite a host of distractors, why it was the Orthodox and not the Gnostics who were thrown to the beasts and burnt at the stake in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But to pursue that would take us too far afield, though it's an interesting point. The point I'm making here is simply this, that for John, there is a constant tension throughout the world, throughout the gospel, between the world as God's world, created and sustained and loved by God, and the world as simultaneously in rebellion against God, refusing to know him and his word, and even organizing itself in opposition to God and his word. And it is this tension which comes then to its climax and focus in the confrontation between Jesus and Pilate, the Word and the world, standing there facing one another. Now, I'm going to return to this in due course. Having indicated that that is my destination in this lecture, I must now advance my first and basic claim, which has to do with today's culture. I suggest that the postmodern climate in which we live though it may appear outwardly hostile to the new types of imperialism which currently stalk our world, cannot in fact do more than raise an ineffectual protest against them and end up merely colluding with them. And this proposal will clear the way for my substantive argument in parallel with the arguments that I've been advancing in the previous 2 lectures, that a fully biblical theology is capable of showing a different way forward through both the complaints of postmodernity and the boastings of the new imperialism, and the cultural minefield which includes them both, and on into new ways of addressing our global community life, for which, to be sure, we need the postmodern critique, lest we slide back into the now barren politics of modernity, but also something, a new impetus, that will take us out the other side and into positive reconstruction, bearing a Christian witness to truth in today's world of power. So my first claim is that the postmodern climate not only cannot effectively critique the new type of empire with which we're faced, but that it actually ends up by colluding with it. And for this we need to sort out some terms. What I mean here by empire and the new imperialism is the new phenomenon that has arisen in this last generation, where before empire meant broadly the sprawling system of rule by one country over other countries, with administration and government flowing from a single central source. Let me remember into colonies on this side of the Atlantic, economic systems which achieve a similar financial and economic effect, but without the direct political, governmental and administrative control. In other words, though the United States does not directly govern, say, Peru on the one hand or Israel on the other, the way the global economic system is set up and run largely from within the United States means that the policies of Peru and the sheer economic existence of Israel are kept in place by Washington. The extent to which this kind of arrangement is properly described as empire is variously debated, and I'm not going to enter that debate tonight as to the appropriateness of the word. Just let the label stand for the moment, and let's note as well that in what follows I am not being anti-American any more than someone who criticizes the policies of Tony Blair is being anti-British. If we can't raise questions about particular policies of particular governments, we really are in deep trouble. Now, I've already sketched some meanings for the term postmodernity in the first lecture, but let me amplify it here to show its relation to empire. Postmodernity is basically a negative term, parasitic on modernity in its reality as well as its semantics, with modernity itself being parasitic on an older Christian, or at least semi-Christian, European culture. And the term postmodernity refers, of course, to the critique and abandonment of modernist culture, which included a view of God, a view of the world, and a view of the whole project to which the supposedly enlightened world of the 18th century was committed. Let's just sketch this worldview, a view of God, a view of the world, and a view of the project, in order then to see how postmodernity has offered alternatives, and then eventually to suggest some Christian ways of coming round the back and offering alternatives again. Modernity's triple worldview then. As for God, modernity tended towards deism, keeping heaven and earth well separated. And this position slides off easily into atheism. You know, God starts off as an absentee landlord and ends up just as an absentee. People run the world as though God doesn't exist, and then from Voltaire and others onwards, they actually say, well, of course, that's because he, in fact, doesn't exist. And within that world, spirituality, Christian faith included, was a private option with the emphasis on private. Despite the continuance of an established church in England at least, and elsewhere, Scotland too, the de jure separation of church and state enjoyed, if that is the right word, by America, has been true de facto in most other Western countries as well. So with God kicked upstairs out of sight, modernity could develop a sharper and apparently more efficient view of the world, and indeed of one's own self. I am the master of my fate, the lonely enlightenment ego. That mirrored the self-made man of the Industrial Revolution, usually was a man, of course, carving out a destiny from a world which was there to be analyzed and exploited, developed, and if necessary, despoiled. Science within this worldview, as opposed to the earlier worldview of more devout writers like Newton, was a matter of humans discovering and learning facts. I forget who the author of the quote was, but it's rather nice, that facts, like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen, were an 18th century invention. Discovering and learning facts and then finding out how to exploit them for profit. Objective facts enabled industry to thrive, which enabled the self-made man to prosper, which enabled, so some believed in theory, a new standard of living to trickle down to everyone else. Plenty of people objected to this theory, of course. We might even hail Charles Dickens as a forerunner of postmodernity, with his scathing denunciation precisely of those for whom the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution seemed to have worked on behalf of those for whom it manifestly hadn't. But for many it did, and it's no part of my purpose today, even though some people sometimes imagine it is, to say that the Enlightenment was purely bad and dangerous and wrong-headed. Just as one obvious example, I have no desire whatever to be operated on by a pre-modern, let alone a postmodern surgeon or dentist. Give me the accuracy and the attention to detail and the technology of high modernity any day, thank you very much. Nor am I out of sympathy with the cultural flowering of the Enlightenment. A close friend told me the other day, and I was rather flattered, that the encyclopedists would have approved of my historical method even though they wouldn't have liked my conclusions. And my postmodern instincts are not nearly strong enough to make me reject Mozart or Beethoven or Schubert. I find Shelley's poems appealing even when I reject his theology, though I confess I find Tennyson at his dullest when he is most in tune with the 19th century mood I just described. The bright light shed by modernity on the self and on the facts about the objective world is in fact overbright, borrowing extra brightness from that which it ignores and without at the time paying the cost, though the bills mounted up. This becomes evident when we look at the third element of modernity, namely the story of progress. This narrative is so deeply embedded within our culture that even now, with postmodernity rampant, one constantly hears it said, now that we live in the modern world, ... and we all know what the speaker means. We are all signed up, so it is assumed, to a view of world history in which things are in fact getting better and better all the time. So that side by side with scientific advances, which are always assumed to be beneficial, there stride political improvements, social amelioration, fresh moral judgments, which are always more enlightened, more universally beneficial than what has gone before. So that any attempt to question them and to insist that some of the old standards were actually better than what we're doing is seen as almost insane or even today criminal. World history, it seems, came out of the tunnel and into the light with the great social and scientific and cultural and political revolutions of the 18th century. And what remains now is to implement that achievement, to work out in the continuing story of post-Enlightenment progress what was implicit in the arrival of Western culture into that which we call modernity. The extent to which this modernist doctrine of progress is a parody of Christian eschatology is a fascinating topic, but for another time. Though I can't resist just the footnote that one of the main reasons in the last 200 years why people have insisted that we know the resurrection of Jesus can't have happened is that if the resurrection of Jesus did happen, that must be the moment when world history reached its climax. But the Enlightenment thinks that world history reached its climax with the philosophy and cultural advances of the 18th century. So there's a kind of a clash of eschatologies driving the pseudo-scientific rejection of resurrection. Think about it. Now, within modernity thus conceived, the project of empire is not just a possibility but an obligation. If we are the enlightened ones, we have a duty to share that enlightenment with the rest of the human race. With the happy result, which of course nobody intended at the time, that as our enlightened culture flowed out to them, their riches would flow back to us. For many of the classic Enlightenment theories, I think of Malthus, a social Darwinian before Darwin himself, there was a determinist edge to this. Improvement is bound to come. Colonial expansion is merely an outworking of the survival of the fittest, who just happen, of course, to believe in freedom, justice, and peace, and all those other wonderful things that empires always claim to possess. And within this, following Rousseau and Voltaire and others, new theories of statehood emerged in which the general public were at last to be permitted a say. And once everyone has the right to vote, they genuinely believed utopia would be achieved. The failure of utopia to arrive on schedule after 200 years goes a long way to explaining the sad look on the face of some French politicians today. Just as the American belief that utopia has arrived and now needs to be defended and extended whether people want it or not helps to explain the steely smiles of some of their North American counterparts. The English, of course, and I think to a considerable extent our Canadian cousins, tend at this point to play the usual game of looking puzzledly in both directions and wondering what's going on. But the 20th century has called all that into question, that whole modernist project and the legitimation of empire which it has sustained. And anyone who doesn't see this calling into question and who imagines that the modernist rhetoric can continue unabated after the Somme, the Depression, Auschwitz, the Gulag, Hiroshima, Vietnam, Rwanda, Bosnia, 9/11, and now Iraq, Darfur, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Gaza, you fill in other blanks. Anyone who can't see this seems to be living in a culpably blind time warp. We simply